Welcome to My Story, a tale of translation, a series dedicated to Final Fantasy X, where we analyze the Japanese English translation of the game and share some secrets from the Japanese Ultimania Omega. The aim, the goal, the purpose of this series is to dig even deeper into a game that continues to be played, discussed, and celebrated more than 20 years after its release, so that we can deepen our understanding of it and appreciation even further. So whether you're a hardcore fan of Final Fantasy X, someone who has an interest in game localization in general, or even if you're just here for the Japanese, I hope you will find something to your liking. And if you do end up liking the video, please consider subscribing to the channel to support the project and the creation of a variety of other interesting Final Fantasy content. But without further ado, it's time for a story.
最後かもしれないだろう。
So just to briefly explain the setup for this analysis, at the top of the screen we have the official English version of the text from the game as it was translated. Then below that, at the bottom of the screen, we have the official Japanese version, and at the very bottom, we have an alternative translation of the Japanese. You might also notice that the Japanese text is color-coded, in this instance yellow, but we also have green and red, green implying a fairly faithful translation, while yellow and red imply some deviation from the source material. However, keep in mind that I'm not trying to criticize the quality of the translation, even though some things might be different. Translation is an art in and of itself in a way, and for games like Final Fantasy X, there is also the added difficulty of making the voiceover actually match up with the Japanese version. Taking a look at the very first line of text, we can already see some differences between the Japanese and the English versions of the game. The first line in English is of course, "Listen to my story," which is a key phrase that gets repeated throughout the game. The sentiment also gets repeated in the Japanese version, but it isn't until a bit later that we get to hear it, the first time being when Auron takes Tidus to Spira. We'll see at the end of this video how that can really change the context of how we are introduced to this line. But for now, just keep in mind that we are being introduced to this key concept earlier and in a different context than in the English version.
だから全部話しておきたいんだ。
I was almost a bit disappointed we didn't get the Final Fantasy X logo here at the beginning, so let me just throw that in there real quick as a sort of personal wish fulfillment. Does that look nice? Does it look nice? Well, it's a nice logo anyway. And now we just wait for the story to begin after this prolonged fade to black. And of course the story begins back in Dream Zanarkand, which is called Yume no Zanarkando in the Japanese version, which means the same thing, Yume meaning dream. So it's Dream Zanarkand. And Dream Zanarkand of course is a totally different place than the real Zanarkand, and it exists in a different physical location, which means that Tidus doesn't really travel through time as we are led to believe early on in the game. And I just mention this because it remains a somewhat common misconception about what is happening in the game. And here we have Tidus emerging from his houseboat, which is docked by the harbor in Dream Zanarkand, and he is met with his enthusiastic fans. Let's try to run over to the fans and milk them for some Japanese. Here we have Tidus' Japanese name, his name of course having been the subject of much debate, with people either calling him Tidus or Titus. And now it has of course been confirmed that Tidus is the official pronunciation, which is more in line with his Japanese name, Tida. Tida. So in Japanese there are a lot of different ways to communicate based on your background or the context of who is speaking. Many different dialects and such. This is emulated to some degree in the English version of the game by giving Tidus some fairly casual phrases such as "no prob" or "alrighty," but it is worth noting that Tidus' speech in Japanese could be taken as a testimony to his age. That doesn't mean that every young person would speak like Tidus, but a lot of his expressions make him sound his age. I wish they had splurged on giving Tidus a pen to sort of really sell this scene.
サインお願いしていいですか？
もちろん。
試合頑 頑張ってね。
This isn't really a big deal, but in the Japanese version, it is explicitly stated a bit earlier that Tidus is going to be competing in some sort of match. But we kind of figured that out anyway thanks to the balls and stuff. But maybe some people thought that Tidus' blue balls had some other significance?
任せとけって。じゃあさ、今夜シュート決めたらこうすっから。それ2人へのメッセージっつうことで。
So if you played the game in English, you might have been wondering whether Tidus was actually hitting on one of them or both of them. But the Japanese confirms that he is actually hitting on them both, which is of course alluding to the dream sequence later on when Tidus can't pick between Riku and Yuna. What a player.
席どこ？
東ブロックです。最前列。私右から5番目ね。
了解っす。
So now that we've signed enough autographs for the moment, we can continue on with the game.
じゃあそろそろ行くわ。応援よろしくな。
せーの。ブリッツボールを教えて。
これから試合だって。
じゃあ終わってから。
今夜は
In the English version, when he's talking to the kids, Tidus sounds like he might actually be considering meeting up with them later that night. This is also supported by the tone of voice the English line is delivered in. In the Japanese version, however, it feels a bit more like he is trying to find the right words to let them down, gently. Konniwa, chotto ne, konniwa ne, konniwa ne, or something like that.
今夜はダメだよ。
Ultimania time! According to the Ultimania, the boy who tells Tidus he can't do anything after the game is always watching him. And it also tells us that this scene is meant to imply that. This is later reinforced by the boy appearing in Tidus' memories, and if you played the game, which I assume you have, you of course know that this boy is not all that he seems.
だろ？明日。
絶対だよ。
約束っす。
Ultimania time. According to the Ultimania, this gesture symbolizes a sphere when performed by members of the Church of Yevon. In Dream Zanarkand, however, and quite possibly the original Zanarkand from 1,000 years ago, this gesture might have implied a blitzball. The Ultimania doesn't confirm that it symbolizes a blitzball, but it does raise the question and thereby imply the possibility. But I guess we'll never know for sure. So in the Japanese Ultimania, this location is known as the freeway or the freeway, even though there are no vehicles present, which is a bit strange for a Machina city. Oh, look at Tidus' pouty HD pudgy face. Yeah.
Here
we get some expositional voiceover from a radio DJ, a very memorable scene, I think, and a strangely memorable character considering that he doesn't play a larger role in the game. For those of you really interested in getting to know the DJ better, the Japanese version of the text actually tells us he has run away from home not once, not twice, but 3 times. What an amazing DJ.
みんなのヒーロージェクトが練習中に行方不明、捜索打ち切り。
The Japanese version also tells us that Jack disappeared during practice and that the search was ultimately called off. And by the way, I hope you like a lot of text on your screen, because as the DJ is talking, you get to talk to the people that are hanging around on the freeway as well.
俺の親父はジェクトの熱狂的なファンださ。親父驚いてるだろうな。ショックだろうな。そう考えたらなんだか泣けてきた。
Here's a very interesting translation choice, since the English version actually gives the DJ a name, as he calls himself Sana, while he's never actually named in the Japanese version. In the Ultimania, he's just referred to as Sarigenai DJ, meaning casual DJ or nonchalant DJ. Maybe Sana is a popular name in Zanarkand, or maybe he's the mayor of Zanarkand, laying low. The English version doesn't go into it, so let's just assume it's a name of some sort.
俺は慌てて家に帰ったね。で、一晩中ジェクトのことを話しちゃったんだ。あんなに親父と話したのは久しぶりだった。おいおいおい、回想シーン。
Here the Japanese passerby issues a pretty straightforward challenge to Tidus, really cranking up the daddy issues by asking Tidus to show them how he will overcome his old man. I'm going to call this man lying in the middle of the street Zanarkand. That's his name now.
シーン入っちまった。さて、あれから10年。
Ultimania time! According to the Ultimania, there are few people on the freeway who are starting to feel a bit ill. This girl is one of them. The reason they are feeling a bit worse for wear is that they can instinctively sense Sin approaching. Furthermore, the Ultimania adds that this is the same phenomena experienced by Waka underneath Makalenia Temple later in the game. I wonder if people are being affected by some sort of gravitational pull from Sin, or whether there is some other justification for why their bodies respond negatively to Sin's presence.
今年から始まったジェクト記念トーナメント。そのきつい潰し合いから勝ち残ったのは、そう、東 A 地区のエイブスと南 C 地区のダグルス。注目はもちろんエイブスのエースのあいつ。去年のルーキーが今年はいきなりエースだ。
Here we see Tidus being named both in the English and the Japanese version, and I wonder whether this is the only place Tidus' name is spelled out like this. If you can think of another example, please let me know down in the comments
いき
below.
なりエースだ。あのジェクトの血を受け継いだ新しい星。今日はどんな動きを見せてくれるのか。今日こそあの幻のシュートが炸裂するのか。
So the English version of this guy feels like he just stepped off a roller coaster, while the Japanese one just stepped off an elevator. There have been some claims that Japanese people are more likely to suffer from motion sickness, but let's try not to read too much into this. Or should we?
期待するなってのが無理だよな。
Here we have some Japanese tough love. As this guy threatens Tidus, he will become a laughingstock if he doesn't play his best. And now we're almost off the freeway, and we still haven't seen a single vehicle, which might explain why all of the people present seem to be somewhat fit. Although it also means that the rumors of a Makina City are somewhat exaggerated.
通して通して。はいはい、ごめんね。遅れちゃうっつーの。引っ張んなって。
The stone guardians protecting the stadium were always really cool. So I wish we knew their backstory, but sadly, I haven't seen anything about it in the Ultimania. The opening song is the same in both Japanese and English, but we'll skip it for time, and possibly to avoid some copyright issues. It's still pretty great. Oh no, the stone guardian has fallen. I guess we'll never know your story now. So let's just continue on with Tidus' story instead.
何ボサッとしてんだよ。
Looking at how Auron is introduced in Japanese and English respectively, we can see some interesting differences. In the English version, Tidus asks him what he's doing there, which makes it sound a bit like Tidus is surprised that he's even there. In the Japanese version, however, Tidus isn't surprised that he's there, but rather that he's just standing around in the middle of all the chaos.
お前を待っていた。またわけわかんないこと。
Here the Japanese line hints at a continual relationship between Tidus and Auron, since Tidus says that once again, Auron has said something that he doesn't understand. It's a relatively quick exchange, but in this instance it seems like the Japanese version is more likely to give the player or to convey to the player a more accurate view of the relationship so far. And I think I prefer Auron's Japanese introduction because I always felt that the role he played in Tidus' life in Zanarkand or Dream Zanarkand was a bit vague, so it's nice to have something a little bit more concrete, even though it isn't really concrete. Well, it's something.
始まるよ。
あ？
泣かないで。
あ？なんだ？待てよ！なあ、こっちやばいって。
見ろ。
Ultimania time! According to the Ultimania, the reason we can't see Sin clearly in the beginning is that it's using its gravity magic to encase itself within a sphere of water. For the purposes of the story and the gradual build-up of the plot, this gives Sin an added sense of mystery, but it's also nice that it's rooted in the game's lore, since Sin uses gravity magic not only to create a sphere of water, but also to form and maintain its body by drawing in fireflies. Is Sin the #1 gravity-based creature in the Final Fantasy series? You decide.
俺たちは神と呼んでいた。
シン
So the first thing I thought when I heard the Japanese version of We Called It Sin was that Auron might be referring to himself, Braska, and Jacked, specifically, since he uses Oretachi, or we, which is a bit masculine. But the Ultimania confirmed that the line is more accurately referring to the people of Spira in general, or as a whole. So the use of Oretachi is just Auron being masculine in general. What a man. So the sword Auron hands to Tidus isn't just a gift or a present from his father, but rather a souvenir bought as a gift while traveling. The Ultimania states that the Japanese version is a little bit of a play on words, since miyake might refer to two different words. Firstly, okimiyake, which could be translated as a parting gift, and would make sense since Jack is believed to have passed away. The second, however, is the more common omiyage, which means souvenir bought as a gift while traveling. The Ultimania states that the second meaning is the right one, and that Jack bought the sword at the travel agency near Lake Macalania. This mention of a souvenir in the Japanese version hints at the importance of the pilgrims later on and gives the sword some added context.
おやつのあ
使い方は実践でな。
In the English version, this scene didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. The line, "I hope you know how to use it," sounds a bit like Tidus either has some prior experience with the sword, or that you don't really need such experience. The Japanese version, however, explains that Tidus will learn by doing, which makes a little bit more sense, even though Tidus might appear to learn a bit too quickly, especially considering the overdrive he will pull off a bit later.
雑魚に構う時間はない。突破するぞ。すべて倒そうとは思うな。邪魔なやつだけ切り捨てて走れ。
As you might have noticed, we'll be fast forwarding or skipping through big chunks of the gameplay because I'm not insane. But one thing worth noting here, as we find our way through the Sinspawn, is that Sinspawns are known as Sin no Kokera in the Japanese version, meaning Sin scales, which might allude to a little bit of a stronger connection between the Sin scales, the little guys we see here, known as Kokirakuzu in the Japanese, and the full-fledged Sin spawns we get to fight later in the game, like this big guy here in the middle of the road.
好き勝手暴れやがって。
まとめて片付けてやろう。
I'm going to give this one to the English Auron. "Some can't wait to die" was always a pretty cool line. Not that there's anything wrong with the Japanese version. And now it's overdrive time, so we get to see Tidus pulling off an amateur move, which is called Spiral Cutto in the Japanese version. But this is of course just the spiral cut we know and love from the English version. Look at him go. Yeah. This battle is epic. And look at all that gravity magic getting thrown around. Here we have our first interaction with a save sphere, or a traveler's save sphere. I've always been a bit interested in the save spheres in Final Fantasy X, since they appear to be a part of the game world in some sense, since we can see non-player characters interacting with them. Therefore, I'm pleased to see that the Japanese version tries a bit harder than the English version to incorporate them into the game world, by mentioning travelers' fatigue or tabi no tsukare. It's not much, but sometimes a little goes a long way. This little bit of flavor text is really tasty to me. And now, just for fun, if you look down into the lower right corner of the screen in a second, you'll see the thing I hate the most about the HD remaster. And yes, it's the little chocobo that continues to ruin shots for me while I'm editing videos. Even during this early part of the game, we are already starting to get a feel for Tidus' disdain for his old man. Here the Japanese version, however, takes it a step further by calling him his shitty old man, or something like that. Here the direction is flipped a bit, since Auron tells Tidus something is coming for them, as opposed to them going to it. They of course meet Sin halfway, but it's still a bit interesting since it emphasizes a bit more clearly, or hints at it a bit more strongly, that they are possibly the target of the attack.
Huh?
手に負えんな。おい、あいつを落とすぞ。
なんで？
面白いものを見せてやる。
Here the Japanese version conveys Auron's sense of humor a bit better, I feel, and a sense of humor is a great thing to be able to retain after going through all that Auron's been through. So let him have his fun, I say. And look at Auron go, bringing down the house. That's something people say, right? This part of the game always gives me anxiety because when I was playing this game on the PlayStation 2 back when it was released, it often crashed right here, meaning that I had to replay this bit again and again whenever I started a new playthrough. Now, let's just enjoy this bit for a bit, because it's quite nice. The Sphincter of Sin. According to the Ultimania, this is Auron checking in with Jack one more time, whether it is okay for him to take Tidus to Spira. So like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, the iconic My storyline doesn't show up in the Japanese version until this scene. And there's a lot going on in this scene that might affect our first impression of this key phrase. Firstly, when Tidus says it in the English version, we are looking at him from behind as he says, "Listen to my story," creating some distance between himself and the player. Here, however, we get a first-person view of Auron saying, "This is your story." According to the Ultimania, this is very intentional, since the "your story" bit is not only meant as a challenge to Tidus, but also to the player, giving not only the line an extra dimension, but also the cinematography some added context as we look up at Auron. I love it. I love it. Thanks for watching the first episode of My Story, A Tale of Translation. I hope you liked it and that you want to see more. If you want to see more, please help support the video by liking it and commenting and maybe even sharing it around. We still have a lot of ground to cover, but together we can make it to the end of the pilgrimage. But until next time, cuckoo! Cuckoo!